Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Alesia Barnava, and I'm the ONA Project Coordinator here at the center. Many of you know that we organize workshops throughout the year so the community as a whole can come together to discuss the issues that are happening and see if there are things that we can act upon to make a difference. In recognition of the United Nations Solidarity Week with people struggling with racism and racial discrimination, which was held last week, we would like to acknowledge the discrimination and the rise in hate crimes against the Asian American community around the states and to advocate culturally sensitive communication when working with immigrants and refugees. And before we begin, just a few reminders. I encourage everyone to use the chat box at any time for any comments or questions you might have during the presentation. We will address them at the end. In addition, please feel free to stay on the video or not, but please keep in mind that the webinar will be recorded and shared later. Now, let me welcome our Asian American guest speakers for today's webinar, Sulien Miller, the Director of Language Services at Mohawk Valley Health System, and Daniel Cribb, the Refugee Health Program Director at Mosaic Health. We appreciate the opportunity to have you with us today, and we look forward to learning about your opinions and perspectives on this matter. And I will now turn the discussion over to the facilitator for today's conversation, the Center's Cultural Competency Trainer, Shana Pughe Dean. Shana has provided presentation and trainings for the Center for over 10 years, including at national conferences. Today, Shana will speak about Asian population in the Mohawk Valley, the differences that exist in the larger Asian community in the US, talk about US historical discrimination, and then what has happened during the pandemic. Shana, welcome, and please take it away. And yep.
Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to be a part of this program. As Alesia mentioned, we want to provide programming that lift up the voices of the communities we're working with. We welcome everybody today to this program. I'm going to be going through my slides pretty quickly because my voice is not the most important voice on today's program. We have our two guest speakers whose voices are much more important than mine in this discussion. The Center's vision is to lead in building community with many cultures, and our mission is to develop the products and services that enable us to build community with many cultures. In addition, we really want to create welcome at our center in the city of Utica, the entire Mohawk Valley, in any organization that we work with. It's very important that we create welcoming communities and welcoming places for any newcomer, whether they speak a different language or not. Being welcoming is so important. We're going to start off today's program with a short video. So I'm actually going to take myself off of video because it will stream better. And I do apologize if it comes in fuzzy for you. We will be sending out to all participants a resource list that will have all the links from the information today and a link to this long documentary. It's actually about an hour. So you will be able to view the whole thing if for some reason it doesn't come through for you right now.
We need to talk about anti-Asian hate.
A wave of violence against elderly Asian Americans.
Violent attacks against Asian Americans.
More than 2,800 reports since the pandemic began.
Man attacks the couple.
Elderly woman is chased by a bully.
Slapped her and lit her clothes on fire.
8 people are dead after shootings.
I never see him again.
Since the coronavirus pandemic began, thousands of Asians in the US have become targets of harassment. The Stop AAPI Hate Reporting Center found that bullying, assaults, and verbal abuse were becoming more normalized across the United States. Now, there are a lot of upsetting incidents that demonstrate this spike in targeted attacks, some of which you might have recently seen shared across social media. But what has always deeply bothered me about this issue is, why have so many of us not talked about this before? Not just online, but in our classrooms or with other marginalized groups or even at our own dinner tables. Why is it that when we need to talk about anti-Asian hate, it often feels like we're talking about it for the first time?
Despite having such a long history in this country, we are not the ones you think of when you think of Americans. And very often people don't take the time to even distinguish between who is Chinese, who is Korean, who is Japanese, and so on. And now we find ourselves in this really tragic and unpredictable situation, not just in America, but around the world with this virus.
He shouted, I don't want your coronavirus in my country. And he swung a punch at me.
Anti-Asian sentiments are nothing new in this country or around the world. To try and determine how we can best protect ourselves while also proactively working with other communities, we'll be diving into the often overlooked and complex history of the Asian experience in America.
I hope that you were able to view that. As I said, we will send out the link to the full documentary, and I highly recommend that you watch it if you are interested in this topic. They go through in more detail the history that I'm going to go through very briefly because we don't have much time here today. As this video points out, some of the reasons we are having this discussion today is awareness. I think that many people born in the US and raised here don't actually learn that much about Asian American history or about the discrimination that the community has faced historically. When we talk about equity and inclusion, it's not just a black and white topic, or one-dimensional. It's not either or, it's both and. So I feel that Asian Americans are still left out of this conversation often, and it's not just between the white, quote, community and other communities. There is also conversations to be had between the African American and Black community and the Asian community and other groups within the United States as well. And it's also, when you think about equity and inclusion, it's not just about race and ethnicity, which are these labels we put on individuals. It's also about class, it's about generation, it's about life experience and where you were raised, how you were raised. So there are a lot of components to that when you are thinking about your equity and inclusion programs that you really have to be more aware of. Stop AAPI Hate, which is an organization that takes reports of discrimination and acts of hate against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, reported 3,292 incidents in 2020. This mainly occurred in California and New York, but was throughout the entire United States. California and New York do have the highest Asian American populations, so this is why. Particularly in LA, they saw about 100% increase in different forms of discrimination and attacks against the community. But this is really just a symptom of the chronic disease of racism and prejudice that we have in our history that we really are not comfortable acknowledging. COVID-19 just gave people a permission and a reason to express their discrimination in a way they had not before. And it should not be an excuse for us to dismiss the historical and systemic racism that exists. We also have to take note that this is a very complex issue. Asia and the Pacific Islands are nearly half the world geographically. And even though we are talking mainly about East Asians and Southeast Asians, it's very important to understand that South Asians, those from India, and that subcontinent, were highly targeted after 9/11 and specifically sought out as well and have experienced historical discrimination in the US. Asian American communities are highly varied. They have different pre-existing health conditions because the population is so different from so many different countries. And there are different disparities in healthcare, education, and general access to services. And COVID-19 just magnified these disparities and highlighted the increased risk that some Asian American communities face, such as being essential workers. Go over a few terms as well. Geography is extremely important. Americans are not good at geography. We need to know where places are in the world. Asia itself is the largest continent. It has 49 UN members. It has the largest population combined of any continent. So you can see all in the green here is what's considered Asia. And geographically, the Middle East is also considered Asia. So that is inclusive of Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran, and other places. But within the context of how the US views race and ethnicity, we have split apart these groups now, and Middle Eastern is somehow considered its own different group. AAPI stands for Asian American and Pacific Islander. So there are a lot of organizations that have those two populations working together. This globe here does not show you the Pacific Islands. So if you add them in, you're talking about even more individuals and countries. And Asian American is a pan-ethnic term for persons with origins in the Far East, Southeast Asia, or the Indian subcontinent. Demographic overview of the Asian migration to the US. Asian migrants have been coming to the US since the 1850s, starting with young men from China who came here as laborers. So not unlike a lot of other groups that came to the US. Some also came because of part of the gold rush. And what many of us don't recognize is the vital role that the Chinese immigrants played in completing the Continental Railroad. They were the primary laborers on the West Coast for that project. Chinese men accounted for 20% of the labor force in California alone by 1870. In 1882, we have the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was the most discriminatory act actually passed by Congress. And it led to an increase in other Asian migrants from Japan, Korea, and India. Many Filipinos came in the 1920s because they didn't have caps on their admittance. And it's also important to remember that the Philippines was a territory of the US for a time. And that's probably also why there was greater migration. Up until 1965, there were still discriminatory immigration laws against Asians. And the civil rights movement actually changed this and allowed some of the individuals to, they increased the cap on that. From 1975, refugees from Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos were coming to the US as refugees. And in 1981, the Refugee Act was passed. So it's very interesting that we had this discriminatory history against Asian Americans, but when we started admitting refugees, Asian Americans or individuals from parts of Asia actually became the largest group that came. And this slide highlights some of those differences in demographics that I was discussing, where there's this bifurcation in the quote Asian American community between those who are highly educated and wealthy. So you can say 61% of adults between 25 and 64 who have come from Asia in recent years have a bachelor's degree. But despite having the highest median income of any racial group, Asian Americans also had the largest income gap of any racial group. And we're not trying to pit that community against each other in any way, but it's important for awareness and knowing which community you're serving, maybe having understanding of a family's history, or if you're servicing someone, what type of history they might be coming from. This is a great little graph from the US Census that shows you some of the current demographics in terms of the largest communities. And Asian populations are actually the largest migrants to the US overall. If you, again, add in all of those different countries and all of the migration that's happening. This highlights those refugee admissions that were mentioned on that other slide. So all of the red color you see here is this geographic area in refugee admissions they call East Asia. It's not even Near East or South Asia, just East Asia. So all of the red in the beginning of the program at the start of this graph are mainly Vietnamese, Cambodian, Laotian, and AmeriAsian. And then as you get into the 2000s, you see the red increase again. That's your population from Burma that started coming and has been coming here as refugees in high numbers for at least 10 years now. Highlight overall, I'm sorry, this is a little fuzzy, but actually all refugee data in terms of admissions to the US is public information. So you will get that link in your, when we send out your resource list. And refugees from East Asia are by far the largest group who have ever come through the refugee program. And from 1989 to 2019, it included AmeriAsians. So you will see we have here our arrival sheet for the center, and it shows overall from 1973 to 2021. And you can see there is a category that says AmeriAsian. What that means are those are individuals who were born from US service members. So on top of having discriminatory policies in the US also has a broad history of wars in Southeast Asia that we don't really learn a lot about as Americans or spend a lot of time understanding that history. And the Vietnam War, we were not just in Vietnam. We were in all of Southeast Asia. We were in Cambodia. We were in Laos. We were in Burma. Even in World War II, we were in Southeast Asia. And we don't recognize this as much in our history. There's been a lot of historical discrimination, as already mentioned. This is a very, very short list of some of the most prominent acts, mostly against Chinese. However, there is a list that shows all of the different laws that were passed that include discriminatory acts against all types of groups through immigration. South Asians from India and also Southeast Asians, and barring people from certain countries. And the list is extremely long. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act is one of the most important and most well-known acts that were passed by the US Congress. It prohibited immigration of Chinese contract laborers for 10 years and prohibited naturalization. There was a Chinese exclusion case in the Supreme Court, and it did rule that an entire race the government deemed difficult to assimilate could be barred from entry, regardless of previous treaties with those countries. And in 1924, so less than 100 years ago, the Immigration Act restricted all Asians from coming into the United States. There is a long history of something called the Yellow Peril, and this idea that Asians were bringing with them disease and were dirty and were looked down upon and were discriminated against with signs saying they are not welcome in places and they should not apply for jobs, and a lot of caricature and cartoons that displayed them as the other. And of course, during World War II, we also had the internment of the Japanese. We interned over 120,000 Japanese. In California, they had their property taken away in some cases. And there's just such a rich history there. We did not intern Germans during World War II, even though that's the group we primarily were fighting against at first. And it's because we were not seeing them as the other. There were so many German migrants, and Americans saw that as part of our identity. We never thought of restricting their movement or putting them in camps, but we thought it was okay to put Japanese in camps. And it's a hard history to understand and swallow, but it's something we really have to look at ourselves. Sulien, one of the guest speakers, is going to be talking about this a little bit, the model minority myth. So I'm not going into this in detail, but it's very important to understand in terms of the prejudice and misunderstanding that's directed towards Asian Americans. It's a minority group that's perceived as particularly successful, especially in a manner that contrasts with other minority groups. It's been mostly used with Asian Americans. It's a damaging concept that was used in contrast to the idea of the welfare queen, also a damaging concept. And it's deceptive and it's an excuse to ignore Asian American needs. And it's used as a shaming device against other racial minorities that drives a wedge between different communities. In terms of the impacts of COVID-19, sorry, I skipped that pretty quickly. There have been, amongst different populations, different impacts from COVID-19. Disparities were intensified, and this discrimination intensified because of the current pandemic. And it's been different for each Asian American community. So you have a lot of Korean or Chinese business owners who were deeply impacted because their businesses had to close down or couldn't operate the same way. You have Burmese and Karen individuals who worked in meatpacking and manufacturing. So a lot of us don't know that a lot of the meatpacking that happens in the US happens from refugee populations that are working there. And COVID-19 disproportionately spread through the manufacturing facilities and also the meatpacking facilities because of just the way they are set up, because of the way the communities were carpooling, and because of multifamily dwellings, and just a misunderstanding of how individuals' lives actually look and how that could be prevented. There are pre-existing health conditions that were prevalent in different communities within the Asian American population. So some refugee communities, why I highlighted the refugee populations that have come here that may consider themselves Asian American, is because you have to understand if someone has that history. Individuals coming from a refugee history may bring with them health conditions we're not used to seeing here. They may be predisposed to other health disparities. They could have compounded trauma from having already experienced discrimination. So if they have come as a refugee, they probably have come here. Most refugees come here because they've been targeted because of who they are and what they believe. So because of their race or ethnicity, they've already been discriminated against by state actors and by individuals where they come from. And they can't go back to their home countries because of this discrimination. And so then they come here and they are told comments, and there are feelings of hate or dislike directed at them based on just the way they look. They've already experienced this in the past. And I also want to mention, which Daniel might talk about, he may or may not talk about, how there's compounded trauma happening within the Burmese population right now because of what is happening in Burma. And this, the coup that happened in Burma recently, if you're not familiar with it and you are working with anybody that is from Burma, you need to educate yourself about that situation, because it is affecting every single individual of that community right now. So I strongly encourage you, if you have no idea what I'm talking about and you have Burmese colleagues, you need to find out what is happening because it is impacting them. And this coup happened right after there was already major impacts of COVID-19 being felt in that community. Especially in Utica and the Mohawk Valley, there were several deaths of community leaders due to COVID-19 and a lot of other stressors happening. So it's very important that community get a little bit more attention right now. The disparities with COVID-19, as I already said, gave permission for racist views to be expressed. There were disparities in education for English language learners. Moving to a virtual platform is not really helpful. And especially if your family doesn't even understand or have even the resources to make that happen. So education will continue to be a point of stress moving out of this pandemic, and access to services. This is a really great report from WHHY, which is the New York City affiliate. They reported out on some of their own investigative reporting, as well as some studies that were done about the disparity in reporting the data around the Asian American community and what was happening with COVID-19. And Asian American data was more likely to be missing or misclassified. There was poor health data that masked the COVID disparities in the community. And American health data showed lower rates of positivity and hospitalizations for Asian Americans, but when the study looked at specific subgroups, the disparities were very clear. There's higher risk factors in that community and pre-existing conditions. And actually, they found in New York City, South Asians have the second highest infection and hospitalization rates for COVID-19. And Chinese Americans actually had the highest COVID-19 mortality rates compared to all racial and ethnic groups. And this just was not being talked about. A lot of other groups were getting focus and attention. So it is important to recognize that you do have to look farther into the data because of, as I already said, how large this population is. Here are some cultural awareness takeaways. Assumption of identity. So assuming a person who appears outwardly Asian or different are immigrants or do not speak English is a fallacy. So some may be immigrants, but some families may have been here since 1891, longer than some of our families have been here. So we cannot just assume because someone looks a certain way that they are an immigrant or don't speak English. I've been encouraging people to change questions about how they ask identity, especially again for these equity and inclusion committees. We're already thinking about this when we think of gender and gender identity, but we should think about it in terms of other identities too. So instead of saying, are you a migrant, a refugee, or an immigrant? Ask, do you identify with the Asian American community, or do you identify as a refugee or former refugee? Some people may not. I was told this really great story in a training I did a few weeks ago from a woman who said she had a patient when she asked if they were an immigrant because it was part of their form because they want to recognize disparities and see if that person needs further assistance, actually worked against them because the person was offended and they said no, even though the provider knew that they had been adopted. That person did not view themselves as an immigrant or a migrant. They had been adopted as a young child from China, but they did not view themselves as an immigrant. And so they had to take the person's lead in terms of their own identity. National rhetoric can change our view of an entire people. So the rhetoric in the US during COVID-19 is called the China virus, the Asia virus. A lot of other names were directed at it being Chinese. Also in general, because of how international relations work, you hear a lot of stories about China and our two countries and what is happening at that level. And we really have to remind ourselves to not let the entire national rhetoric change our view of how we see our neighbors and friends. It happened to the Japanese during World War II, Russians during the Cold War. So we have to be aware of how national rhetoric is impacting our own thinking. We have to confront our bias and lack of understanding. Did this crisis really cause this problem we're talking about? Or is it just amplifying existing disparities and bias? And May is Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And here's information if somebody needs to report incidents or get support or to learn more. We do encourage you for emergencies, obviously, to call 911. You can report to these organizations. If you are working with somebody who is experiencing discrimination and doesn't know where to turn, or if you yourself are experiencing it and just don't know what to do or don't feel comfortable, you can contact the center. It's not what we do, but we are here to help. And we will find the place that can help you or take your report or something because we do not want you out there feeling alone. Now, I do want to turn it over to our guest speakers because they are, as I said, the voices you want to hear from today. Sulien Miller is the Director of Language Services Program at MVHS. And we also have Daniel Cribb with us today, who's the Director of Refugee Health at Mosaic Health in Utica. I believe Sulien is going to be speaking first today. And Sulien, if you are there, can you please turn on your video?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I'm going to actually stop sharing my screen.
Okay, let me see. Hi, that good?
Yes, I see you. And there is an option for individuals on the call to change your view to speaker view if you are having trouble seeing Sulien for any reason. But the floor is yours, Sulien. I'm going to mute myself and you can talk about this issue and how you view what we're talking about today.
Thank you, Shana, and greetings, everyone. It's my honor to be here with you all today. I am a Taiwanese American and grew up in a fairly traditional Chinese cultural environment. I am culturally Chinese. However, I am not a Chinese national because I had never been to China. I cannot visit there without my passport or apply for visa. I'm saying this, just want to illustrate the diversity and complexity of the term Asian American, and also answer lots of questions I have gotten from people, where are you from? And it can sometimes can be more complex than just a term. Okay, we went through a year of great loss and great uncertainty caused by the COVID-19 global pandemic. Our country has lost more than 500 lives and counting. Many studies, as Shana has pointed out, shown that the pandemic has a disproportionate impact on minority communities. Among minority communities tend to be with a higher infection and death rate and a greater economic impact. All the social factors in the normal time that are challenging, like childcare, in this time, it becomes amplified. Like kids are stay home for school, parents need to work. Asian American communities, however, were confronted with added intensified racial discrimination using the excuse of COVID-19. The surge of hate crimes and violence incidents against people look like Asians grew more than 150% in many US cities. Asian Americans are verbally harassed. Sentences like, you don't belong here, you are not welcome here, go back to China, you bring the coronavirus here. Asian American will be spit on, hit with object, physically assaulted, and yes, senselessly murdered. Just yesterday, I heard a report of a 65-year-old woman who was pushed onto the ground, kicked repeatedly on her way to church. While the assault was happening, none of the bystanders, including a security guard in the nearby apartment building, had done nothing to help. This kind of senseless attack on Asian American has gained national attention, and I'm very happy yesterday to hear that our government finally taking some initiative to counter this wave of anti-Asian attack. An ABC News report using data released by the reporting forum staff AAPI Hate revealed nearly 38 incidents were reported roughly in a year. Women report hate incidents 2.3 times more than men. A further examination showed that many of these assaults against Asian women tend to be in connection with sexist attitudes toward Asian women. The stereotypical perception of Asian women is the ones who are submissive. The image does make Asian women become easy target of this assault. I have no doubt our former President Trump and other politicians using the kind of rhetoric like Chinese virus, Kung Fu flu, Wuhan virus, partially contribute to the wave of anti-Asian violence. However, racism doesn't exist in a vacuum. We have long history to place blames on a far unfamiliar place to a group of minorities with a history of being labeled as the other. In fact, Asian Americans have been seen as a forever foreigner. There is a long history to see Asian American as unworthy of being the citizen here. The early Chinese immigrants were deemed filthy and disease-ridden and not able to assimilate into the culture. This historic context that barred Asian Americans from immigration policies is very important to understand the current climate. The targeted violence and physical expelled this group of people happened in late 19th century. The 1970 Nationality Act, the 1875 the Page Act, and 1882 the Chinese Exclusion Act laid the groundwork for the Rock Spring Massacre and violent hostilities of Tacoma and Seattle in 1885. All those incidents are targeted Chinese American in these cases, but later this kind of hostility expanded to other to other Asian American groups. It has gone a long way for Asian American to be called model minority from the early image of being labeled as yellow peril. The term model minority was first coined by sociologist William Peterson at UC Berkeley. His New York Times piece titled Success Story, Japanese American Style, solidified a popular image of Asian American as having strong work ethic and family value. According to him, despite having faced the most discrimination and the worst injustice to a person alive a day, Japanese Americans was first molded into this success immigrant stories. Later, this model of minority include most of people of Asian descent, particularly those of East and South Asia. However, this positive narrative of model minority has its dark side. First of all, this model minority image of Asian allows us to disregard many differences of Asian American community. There are lots of disparity in this group, and because this model minority and portray happy, successful stories, lump everybody into one. And of course, we all look alike. Well, I'm joking about this, okay? And second, these narratives also used to divide community of color. It pits one against the other. It breeds resentments against Asian Americans. It also prescribes the kind of behavior like Asian American, if you work hard, you will be successful and you better well behaved. And that causes lots of mental issues, and also instill the idea about putting the blame on anybody who are not economically successful, who are not self-reliant. It's all their own fault because they are not working hard enough. And what I really want you to take away is that, yes, history tends to repeat itself. And if our goals are to advocate racial justice for Asian Americans, we need to form a consistent coalition among communities of color. The tactic that white supremacists use to maintain the racial hierarchy is the same, like instill somebody as like model minority and to establish certain racial hierarchies and to pick one against the other. I have no doubt many people are happy when they think about they are glad they are not the faces at the bottom of the barrel. They are not always the target or the assault. However, all the social dominants are the same. The kind of social dominants pick one group against the other, place one group just because of their skin color will be also used. If we allow those kind of social dominants to harm one of our social group, it will be harm everybody because our different many social characteristics such as race, gender, our social economic classes, age, language preferences, and social orientations place us in a unique social location. And we may see the world differently. And we need to understand social dominance. One of these days, if we allow that to happen, one of these days, they can pick any one of those social characteristics to oppress us. So history has shown that racial injustice affects everyone. It is the same kind of social dominance that people exclude you because they can, and our society also allowed. Thank you. I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sulien. That was really great and a great history and a really great perspective in terms of the model minority, but also in terms of groups coming together and the implications if we do not. I really appreciate your time. Is there anything more you want to say on the topic before we have Daniel talk?
Yes, I would like to mention about this some resources for bystander intervention training published by the group, I think Asian American Advanced Justice. I will send that to you, okay?
Yes, please send that to us and we will send it out to all the participants. That's great information. Thank you.
Thank you. Then I will turn myself up, okay?
Yeah. We now welcome Daniel Cribb, who is the Director of Refugee Health at Mosaic Health, to share his views on this topic.
Good morning, everybody, sorry. Thank you, Shana, and thank you, Alesia, for inviting me to be on this panel discussion. As Shana and Sulien, they already covered enough, so I'll be talking primarily from my personal experience that, being working in the refugee help and also refugee resettlement field for past decade. This matter is very dear to me. Those of you who don't know me, Shana knew me personally because we used to work together, and just to share you my own experience. Before I come back to work in the Utica, I hope, Shana, you don't mind me sharing this, but my name Daniel Cribb itself is it can be misleading. So before I came back to work in Utica resettlement office, Shana thought that I was this white American that is working passionately with the refugees. But when I returned to Utica back in 2008, and when she met me, and then Daniel Cribb wasn't the one that she was expecting. So just to throw under the bus here, but it is what it is. The thing, with discrimination and among the Asian and Pacific Islander, communities been existing prior to this COVID-19 pandemic, but I believe this pandemic and then a previous administration really amplify, from my own opinion, like it really amplify this, racial discrimination against my community. Like, I mean, when I look at Central New York, for example, whenever we go out to the grocery store, last year, like personally, me and my wife, we went to buy grocery store last year, in the middle of pandemic. We were shunned away, in a way that like people looked at us as if like we are dangerous, like disease carriers, and they tend to walk away from us. So it is in a way, it's, we feel like it's a bit demeaning, but given the circumstances, then we just have to accept, the reality, and move on, try to move on with our lives and try to be positive. And we have community members, like their houses being vandalized, and spray painted, beside their house, with profanity, like curse words, like, F Asian, go back to your country. And we, last year, for example, an instance like where a Korean family, there was a brick thrown into the window, broke the window, and they heard them screaming, like F Asian, go back to your country. So these incidents like did occur right here in Mohawk Valley, and for more or less, Asian community, particularly with the Burmese Korean refugee population right here, they felt that effect, because of this COVID-19 pandemic and the amplification of this like racial, discriminatory rhetorics by our, elected leaders. And I mean, it's really, it didn't brought to the internet, like to the media attention until the recent event in Atlanta. That's another thing, is that like, some folks in this community viewed us as, like some sort of like exotic individuals. Excuse my language, but I mean, that's a reality. Whenever I hear individuals like making fun of, like whenever they go visit these like nail salon or spa, and then they come back and like talk, like I don't even understand what they're saying. Like, their accents is very funny. I may be Asian. I don't, I may not have accent, but slight accents. But whenever I hear those things, it just really, it made us as an Asian American, like it really made me feel upset. But at the same time, like, and I have a way of like understanding the situation and the other individuals, and probably they don't grow up in a diverse community. And I tend not to blame it, but accept the reality and move on. But at the same time, I feel as an Asian American, like this discrimination, how long is it gonna go on? So, I'm just saying it from first person perspective. And I'm sure like, here, like among our participants today, even some of them can share their own personal experience, like what they have gone through. I've seen some from my community, after I speak, like probably you can share. So bottom line is that like, yes, we recently arrived individual into this country, But at one point, I would like to remind each and every one of you that at one point, our, elders, like our ancestors, came here to this country, particularly like, if you're like Polish, like, Eastern European or Mediterranean background, like our ancestor, like, when we came here, we gone through the, some sort of discrimination. And let us all remind ourselves that, this is the nation that founded upon by immigrants, that, we have to remind ourselves to be welcoming and accepted, and then, be mindful and be open-minded about, our new neighbors, like the Asian, particularly with the Burmese Korean refugees from Asia that coming into Mohawk Valley area. And like Shana mentioned earlier, these individuals are already coming with, emotional baggage, but they all have this like positive optimism and resilience about building a new life, for their family, for their loved ones right here in this, foreign land. But they're going to be calling, they call this place home. And, we don't want to see, unwelcoming, like these negative rhetorics against us. So this is just personally sharing from my experience. And if you have any questions regarding about that, you can feel free to ask me questions. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Those were really great comments. Thank you for sharing your personal experience and for encouraging everybody to remain welcoming. And also, thank you so much for pointing out the resiliency issue and thinking of resilience. Is there anyone, we have just a few minutes, we can take some comments, or if there's anyone in the audience that has something personal to share, we can take a few comments, I think, if there's anyone out there. It's okay if there is not, but if somebody does have something they want to share, now is the time.
Hi, can I say something?
Of course you can, Lupuedo. Welcome. Please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Lupuedo, and I'm a president of the Utica career community. At first, I didn't feel comfortable sharing or talking about these issues, but after all of this discussion, I think I want to share a few things. I personally went through a lot of incidents when I was asked to go back to China, but I did not come from China or Japan or Korea like that. But what I really want to share is that I think a lot of the incidents, the discrimination on Asians, especially I can speak on the Korean community, a lot of the incidents are not even reported. And because a lot of times they feel that even they reported, they did not get help. I had one incident back in 2013 when we reported to the law enforcement here, and then the case was closed only a few days later. And we felt like there was no efforts to investigate the case. So I think a lot of incidents happens in around here are not even reported. The smaller one, when someone got attacked, a punch, or even a bullet hole through their walls, they did not even report it. So I think a lot of things are not. I mean, the statistic may be even higher. That's my my point.
Thank you so much, Lupuedo, for sharing those personal comments. I can only consider that it's not easy for any of you to come out publicly, and especially in a group this large, or to make public comments when you may identify yourself as being from these communities. These are not easy things to talk about. And so I really do appreciate you being open about that with everybody, because I think it needs to be heard, and your voice is very important to this community as well. You are doing so much out there. So thank you.
So just a quick comment on that, like I've been called Chinese, although like, my nose is too big to be Chinese. I mean, excuse my sense of humor, but at grocery store, not in Utica area, but like, like North Country, I've been called names like, go back, and then I say like, go back to your country. And I mean, like immediately, like I do live by, like overcome my stress and discrimination by like my sense of humor. So like immediately, like you mean like, back to America, because I am a citizen of this country. But at the same time, I can see the threat that my wife feel, because she's a recent immigrant to this country, and she looks more, Asian than I am. So it was like very, how do I say this? Like going up to like North Country, like Old Forge area, like it's becoming a sense of like an unwelcoming area for like, for us. And going back to, like Duque comment about these incidents, in Utica alone. Yeah, I mean, there are several incidents that like, our community is afraid or not reported because we think that, like, first of all, we couldn't communicate because of the lack of like English. And also another thing is that we feel as if like the law enforcement didn't take us, the community, seriously. So that's, that's the reality itself.
If you do want to learn more about this topic, actually, I have a few action steps you can take away to use your awareness, correct misinformation, and call people out. So make sure if you're hearing things, you tell people that. Be an ally, so listen, support, and advocate. Don't assume you know their experience. Don't be that kind of ally that just says things. Take action and take the individual's lead. Take the lead from the community. And also keep in mind with your committees that one Asian American voice does not represent every Asian American voice, just like one Black voice does not represent every Black voice. So be very careful about tokenizing when it comes to equity and inclusion committees and programs. That's extremely important. If you want to learn more about this topic and become culturally aware, we are having a training session next Wednesday from 9 to 12. It's only $25 per person, and you can register on our website. And now I'm going to have Alesia just close down the program. But again, please stay on if you want to chat about anything or answer Heather's question.
Thank you, Shana. Thank you again very much for your efforts in spreading Asian American culture awareness in our community and for providing us with extremely useful information at this time of great concern. Also, thank you, Daniel and Sulien, for your participation in this discussion and for sharing your personal and professional views on this topic. And before we close up the webinar, I just want to take a moment and to highlight one of the ONA's services, which is legal services available to the community. ONA legal counsels are actually today with us on this call. They are available to help out and provide advice for immigration-related issues or applications. So feel free to contact me and I will set up an appointment for you. And in closing, I just want to say that we are hopeful that this workshop will reduce racial discrimination against Asian Americans and help develop culturally sensitive approaches when communicating or working with immigrants or refugees. The recording of this presentation will be made available on the Center's Facebook page at the Center Utica or our YouTube channel in the coming days. Again, thank you everyone for joining us this morning, and we are the Office for New Americans Opportunity Center at the Center, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you everyone and have a great day.